one of the important inventions of the early 19th century is photography. The word photography itself means light writing. The prefix photo means light, and the last part of the word, that root word graphy, means writing. And photography in some form has been around for a much longer time than the early 19th century. However, it wasn't until the early 19th century that we began to have a way to record the images. So the actual idea of a camera, which is a Latin word that actually means room, was invented sometime around 400 BCE, or possibly even earlier than that. The earliest version we have comes from China, and that's the first time this occurs in written history. But we know that Aristotle is familiar with a similar invention just around 50 years later in ancient Greece. This rapid geographic spread suggests that this may be a tool that was around before this, it just hasn't entered written history. We don't know about it. The original camera is what we call the camera obscura, which is a Latin phrase that means dark room, and it was used as a scientific instrument rather than as we might think of a camera being used today to record an image. And it was typically used to look at things that were too bright or that were somehow harmful to the naked eye. So it was used commonly to do things like view solar eclipses or to look at the sun. And early versions of the camera obscura, like the one Aristotle used, didn't use lenses to focus the image. So you would go into a room, like the one shown in this drawing from the Renaissance, and whatever was outside would be projected onto the back wall. However, without any lens to focus the image would not only be upside down, it would most likely be at least somewhat blurry. With the invention of new lenses in the Renaissance period, these images began to get better, and many art historians believe that some version of the camera obscura was used by artists like Vermeer in the 17th and 18th century to set up their composition and to preview what something might look like before going to all of the work of actually painting a work of art. After the invention of lenses, we also learned that you don't actually have to be inside of the camera to see the image, and smaller portable versions develop. And it's this smaller portable version that's used by artists to trace and to set up compositions that eventually becomes the camera we know today. The artist who's most associated with early photography is Joseph Nice, and he was actually inventing, or trying to invent, a printmaking process. He was experimenting with a substance called bitumen, which is a kind of natural tar that's been used as far back as the Roman and Egyptian empires. And one of the things that by the 19th century we knew about bitumen is that when it's exposed to light, it's hardened. So he was actually using this to make a resist for acid-etched prints. And he takes the first photograph by preparing a plate using a mixture of bitumen and lavender oil, and then setting it in his camera obscura and exposing it to the scene outside. So that's how we get this image on the slide, which is generally considered to be the oldest extant photograph. This is the view out the window of Nice's high attic studio. Unfortunately, we can tell by looking at this photograph that it wasn't a very efficient process. It's blurry, it's hard to see what's going on, and it had a very long exposure time. We know that the exposure time on this photograph was a minimum of 6 to 8 hours, which means that anything that moves, including people, animals, and even plants, appear at best as blurry blobs in this photograph, and only large permanent objects like buildings can be seen at all. Ultimately, this was not at this point a very practical process, and it was seen more as a novelty than anything else. But throughout the 19th century, the possibilities of photography began to develop and expand very quickly.